Love can be a crueler prison than any iron chain. The train whistled for the third time as Thomas Mitchell got off at the small Cedar Creek station, his boots touching the worn wood of the platform with a dry sound that echoed in the warm afternoon air. He carried only a brown leather suitcase and a yellowed envelope in the inner pocket of his jacket, where 2 letters had rested during the last 6 months of the trip. His hands trembled imperceptibly as he adjusted his hat against the inclement Arizona sun. The city stretched out before him like a mirage of hope and terror. Low wooden houses lined the main street, where dust danced in lazy swirls. The heat rose from the ground in visible waves, distorting the landscape as if reality itself doubted its presence there. Thomas knew his life had changed course the moment he decided to respond to those 2 ads in the San Francisco newspaper. 2 women, 2 letters, 2 promises of happiness in a land where loneliness killed more men than bullets. The first letter had arrived signed by Margaret Sullivan, a 32-year-old widow who ran a boarding house in the center of town. His handwriting was delicate, almost shy, and his words spoke of quiet afternoons sewing on the porch and the desire to find a gentle companion to share the burdens of life. She had lost her husband in a mining accident 2 years earlier and was looking for someone who knew how to value the simplicity of a quiet life. The second letter came from Eleanor McCarthy, a 28-year-old woman who had inherited a small ranch in the hills north of Cedar Creek. His handwriting was firm and decisive, his sentences charged with an energy that jumped off the paper. It spoke of wild horses, starry nights in the desert, and the need for a partner strong enough to build something great in that barren land. He had come from the East 3 years earlier, fleeing from a family that did not approve of his independence. Thomas had answered both, unable to decide which of the 2 lives called him more. For months, he maintained correspondence with both, creating 2 different versions of himself. To Margaret, he was a serene man in search of peace. To Eleanor, he was an adventurer ready to break new ground. Duplicity bothered him, but the loneliness in San Francisco had become unbearable after his mother's death. Now, standing on the station platform, he felt the weight of the lie he had built. The 2 women were waiting for him. The 2 believed that they would be their only choice. The 2 had organized their lives around the promise of a shared future with a man who might not really exist. The sun was beginning to decline over the horizon when Thomas finally moved toward the center of town. His steps were measured, as if each one took him deeper into a labyrinth with no way out. Margaret's boarding house was 2 blocks from the station, a 2-story building painted white that stood out among the other buildings. Through the open windows, she could see lace curtains fluttering in the warm breeze. Across the street, a grey mustachioed man swept the entrance to a hardware store, watching the newcomer with thinly disguised curiosity. In small towns, strangers were noteworthy events, especially those who arrived with the appearance of those carrying secrets. Thomas stopped in front of the boarding house, his right hand clutching the envelope in his pocket. Through the living room window, he could glimpse a female figure arranging flowers in a vase. Margaret, the woman who had written about the peace she found in the care of plants and the preparation of simple meals, the woman who dreamed of quiet conversations at the end of the day and the warmth of constant company. But when he looked up to the hills to the north, where Eleanor's ranch was hidden among the red rocks, he felt a different tightness in his chest. There lived the woman who rode her own horses and repaired her own fences. The woman who had written about the wild beauty of the desert and about dreams too big to fit into small spaces. 2 possible lives stretched out before him, like roads diverging in the desert. One led to the security of the known, to the simple pleasures of a predictable existence. The other led into the uncharted territory of adventure, where the risks were as great as the rewards. The wind blew harder, raising the dust from the street and making the signs in the shops creak. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, trying to find courage for what he knew he needed to do. He could not continue to deceive 2 honorable women. He could not build his happiness on a lie that would inevitably crumble. When he opened his eyes again, his decision was made. I would visit both, I would tell the truth. He would face the consequences of his actions and hope that some form of forgiveness would be possible. It was the only way to find out which life really belonged to him. The shadow of the boarding house stretched across the street like a finger pointing to the uncertain future. Thomas took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked toward the front door, knowing that each step took him farther away from the man he had been and closer to the man he might become. The door to the boarding house opened before Thomas could even knock. Margaret Sullivan appeared on the threshold, as if she had been waiting for his arrival for hours, her brown eyes shining with a mixture of joy and nervousness that made his stomach tighten. She was smaller than he had imagined, with brown hair tied up in a simple bun and a light blue dress that enhanced the delicacy of her movements. Her smile lit up her entire face as their gazes met. Thomas felt the weight of guilt press against his chest like a stone. This woman had organized her entire life around his arrival, and he was there carrying secrets that could shatter any possibility of happiness between them. Margaret led him through the living room, where the smell of cinnamon and fresh bread wafted through the air like a welcoming embrace. The walls were decorated with photographs in simple frames and small embroideries that spoke of hours of patient work. Everything in the house breathed order and care, just as his letters had suggested. She had prepared a special dinner. The table was set with his finest crockery, and lighted candles created an intimate atmosphere that made Thomas feel all the more unworthy of the warm welcome. As she poured the stew of fresh meat and vegetables, he watched her graceful movements and the way she occasionally looked up to stare at him, as if she still didn't believe he was really there. During the meal, Margaret spoke about the city and its inhabitants. He told of the Johnson family, who had lost the harvest to the locusts the previous summer, and of old Samuel Pierce, who spent his days on the porch of the barber shop telling stories of the time when Cedar Creek was just a stopping post for travelers. Her voice was soft and melodious, and Thomas realized how she knew every person in the city, how genuinely she cared about their joys and sorrows. As the night deepened and the candles burned lower, Margaret finally touched on the subject they had both avoided. She talked about how her letters had brought light to the lonely days after her husband's death, how he had reread each word dozens of times, looking for the promise of a less empty future, how I had dreamed of this moment for months. Thomas felt his throat tighten. Her every word was like a blade cutting through his consciousness. He knew he needed to tell the truth, but the words refused to come out. How could he destroy that radiant hope? How could he admit that he had shared his attention, his feelings, his promises with another woman? The evening progressed with Margaret showing him the rooms of the boarding house, explaining how she had renovated each one, with a view to making the place more welcoming to guests. She had plans. I wanted to expand the business, maybe add a small restaurant. He talked about these dreams as if Thomas was already an integral part of them, as if their futures were already sealed by the letters they had exchanged. When she finally led him to the room she had prepared for him on the second floor, Thomas noticed the care in every detail. Clean white sheets, a small table with paper and ink for correspondence, fresh flowers in a vase in the window. On the wall, an empty frame waited for the photograph they would take together, symbolizing the beginning of their new shared life. Margaret stopped in the doorway, her hands nervously smoothing the skirt of her dress. There was an unformulated question in her eyes, a vulnerability that made Thomas understand how much she had invested emotionally in that moment. She had opened not only her home, but her heart, to a man she knew only through letters. When she finally withdrew, wishing him good night in an almost whispered voice, Thomas sat on the edge of the bed and buried his face in his hands. The silent room seemed to echo with the weight of his lies. Through the window, he could see the lights of the city going out one by one, until only the silver moon illuminated the deserted streets. In the hills to the north, he knew that Eleanor McCarthy was on her ranch, probably tending the horses or repairing some equipment by the light of a lamp. She was also waiting for him. She also had plans that included her presence. She had also opened her heart to a man who existed only on paper. Thomas took out of his pocket the last 2 letters he had received. Margaret's, delicate and fragrant, talked about the preparations for her arrival and about the joy she felt when she imagined their conversations at the end of the day. Eleanor's, written on thicker paper, described the foals that had been born in the spring and how she longed to show him every corner of her estate. 2 women, 2 lives, 2 possibilities of happiness that were mutually exclusive. The night wind made the window creak softly, a sound that matched the torment in his chest. I knew that in the morning I would need to make a decision. I could not continue to live in lies. I could not allow both to continue nurturing hopes that might never be realized. But as he sat in that carefully prepared room, listening to the nightly sounds of Cedar Creek, Thomas realized that his choice would be far more complex than simply deciding between 2 women. It would be choosing between 2 versions of yourself, 2 completely different futures, two different ways of living the rest of your life. The clock in the living room struck midnight, marking the end of his first day in that city. Tomorrow, inevitably, he would have to start unraveling the web of deception he had woven, even if it meant losing both women who had come to love the version of him that existed only in his letters. Dawn brought with it the unforgiving heat of the desert, and a decision Thomas could no longer postpone. After a sleepless night, he went downstairs to breakfast, determined to confess everything to Margaret, but she had left early for the market, leaving only a note saying she would be back at noon. Fate seemed to conspire to prolong his agony. Thomas took advantage of Margaret's absence to hire a horse at the local stable. The owner, a white-bearded man named Jake Morrison, watched him curiously as he groomed the animal. Everyone in town already knew about the suitor who had come from San Francisco to marry the widow Sullivan. In small places, news traveled faster than the wind. The ride to Eleanor's ranch took 2 hours through winding trails that climbed up the rocky hills. The sun beat down his back as the horse advanced through the barren terrain where only hardy bushes and cacti could survive. With every step, Thomas felt as if he was moving away not only from the city, but from the version of himself he had created for Margaret. The ranch appeared on the horizon as a mirage of wood and iron. It was smaller than he had imagined, but there was something majestic about the way it blended into the wild landscape. A sprawling corral housed about 20 horses, their coats gleaming in the sun. A low wooden house stood next to a barn, both built to withstand the strong winds that swept across the hills. Eleanor McCarthy was in the pen when he arrived, taming a brown colt that struggled against the rope. She was bigger than Thomas expected, with broad shoulders and muscular arms that spoke of years of hard work. Her blonde hair was tied in a practical braid, and her leather clothes showed stains of sweat and dust. When she saw the visitor approaching, she immobilized the foal with an experienced movement and turned to face him. The smile that lit up her face was different from Margaret's. Where the widow showed delicacy and shyness, Eleanor radiated confidence and strength. Her blue eyes shone with an intensity that made Thomas understand why she had managed to survive alone in this inclement land. This was a woman who needed no protection, but partnership. She led him to the house, where the decor was Spartan but functional. Animal skins covered the wooden floor, and the walls displayed horseshoes, ropes, and other horseworking instruments. There were no flowers or delicate lace, but a different beauty emanated from the robust simplicity of the environment. Eleanor brewed strong coffee on an iron stove while talking about the ranch. Her voice was clear and decisive, without Margaret's soft tones. He told of how he had bought the property from an old farmer who had given up after losing half his herd in a storm, how he had rebuilt the facilities with his own hands, how he dreamed of expanding breeding and perhaps establishing a trade route to the larger cities. Over the simple lunch of jerky and beans, Thomas watched as Eleanor moved with economic efficiency. Every gesture was practical, without wasting movement. She talked about her plans as a general discussing battle strategies. He wanted to buy more land. He wanted to cross his mares with purebred stallions. I wanted to build something that would last generations. When she mentioned the letters they had exchanged, her eyes softened slightly. She admitted that she was not a woman of beautiful words, but that she had found in him someone who seemed to understand her need for freedom, someone who wouldn't try to cage her in a conventional home life, someone strong enough to be by their side as they conquered that hostile land. In the afternoon, Eleanor took him to meet the horses. Each animal had a name and a personality that she described with genuine affection. He showed him the pregnant mare that would give birth in a few weeks, the black stallion he had bought from a Mexican merchant, the foals that had been born in the spring. His passion for animals was evident in every word, in every careful gesture. As the sun began to decline, painting the sky orange, Eleanor and Thomas sat on the porch of the house. The view stretched across miles of wild landscape, where the mountains were silhouetted against the horizon like sawtooth. The silence was broken only by the occasional neighing of horses and the whistling of the wind between the rocks. Eleanor talked about her life before the ranch. She had come from Boston, fleeing a family that wanted to marry her to a wealthy merchant who would treat her as another of their possessions. She had worked as a housekeeper to save enough money to buy the ticket to the West. She had faced storms, cattle rustlers, and the biting loneliness of the first winters alone, but he had never regretted it. As night approached, she offered him lodging so he wouldn't have to make the return trip in the dark. Thomas accepted, knowing that he needed more time to understand this woman and the world she had built. The guest room was simple but clean, with a window that overlooked the corral where the horses rested under the stars. Lying on the narrow bed, Thomas felt torn between two completely different universes. Margaret represented the stability, the comfort of a predictable life where the challenges were small and manageable. Eleanor symbolized adventure, the possibility of building something great in a land that forgave no weaknesses. Both women had opened their lives to him based on letters that painted only part of the truth. Both deserved honesty. They both deserved a man who chose to be with them entirely, not torn between two possibilities. The coyote howled in the distance, a wild sound that echoed through the hills like a wail. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to imagine his life next to each of the women. With Margaret, he glimpsed quiet afternoons, whispered conversations, the peace of a loving routine. With Eleanor, she saw constant challenges, growth through adversity, the thrill of building an empire from nothing. Two women, two worlds, a choice that would define not only his future, but the essence of who he really was. Fate has a peculiar way of forcing the hands of men who hesitate to make difficult choices. Thomas woke up at Eleanor's ranch with the firm intention of riding back into town and telling the whole truth to both women. He had rehearsed the words through the night, looking for a way to minimize the pain he would inevitably cause. But when he went downstairs for breakfast, he found Margaret Sullivan sitting at Eleanor's kitchen table, her two suitcases positioned by the door. The silence that settled in the environment was more deafening than any scream. Margaret stood pale, her hands shaking slightly as she held a cup of coffee Eleanor had offered her. Eleanor stood by the stove, her arms folded and an expression of bitter understanding on her face. Both knew. Somehow, the truth had emerged before he had the courage to reveal it. Margaret had figured it all out the night before. When Thomas did not return to the boarding house, she chatted with Jake Morrison, who casually mentioned about the man who had rented a horse to visit the McCarthy ranch. Suspicion grew in his chest like a weed. She rummaged through his room and found Eleanor's letters hidden in the suitcase. Every line he read was like a dagger going through his heart. Eleanor, for her part, had understood the situation the moment she saw Margaret arriving at her estate at dawn. The determination in the other woman's eyes, the way she asked about Thomas, all confirmed what a part of Eleanor already suspected. Single men who maintained romantic correspondence rarely limited their options to a single woman. The two looked at each other across the table, studying each other as adversaries assessing strength. Margaret, delicate and wounded, but with an iron dignity that kept her upright despite the betrayal. Eleanor, strong and practical, accepting the situation with the same resignation with which she accepted the storms of the desert. Thomas stood in the doorway, watching the two women who had put their trust in him. He felt smaller than a coward, unworthy of the love of any of them. Shame burned in his chest like red-hot iron, but he knew that now he had to face the consequences of his actions. Eleanor was the first to speak, her voice controlled but charged with disappointment. He said he had suspected from the beginning that a man like Thomas might be exploring multiple possibilities, that he had chosen to believe the cards because loneliness sometimes makes intelligent people blind to obvious truths, that she didn't blame him entirely, because she understood the desperation that leads someone to seek connection in any way possible. Margaret remained silent for a long moment before speaking. When he finally did, his words were measured and painfully dignified. He said he had reread all of Thomas's letters during the night, looking for signs he should have noticed, that he had found vague references that now made sense, that she felt foolish for having opened her heart so completely to someone she didn't really know. Thomas tried to explain, but the words came out garbled and inappropriate. He talked about loneliness in San Francisco, about how their letters had brought light to his dark days, about how he had lost himself between two possibilities of happiness, but his justifications rang hollow, even to his own ears. There was no explanation that could mitigate the betrayal he had committed. Eleanor moved to the window, watching her horses in the corral. He said that he had built his life on the brutal honesty that the desert demands, that there was no room in his existence for men who couldn't be direct about their intentions, that Thomas was welcome to stay for breakfast, but after that should go on his way. Margaret rose from the table, smoothing her skirt with mechanical gestures. He declared that he would return to the boarding house and that Thomas's room would be available until the next train to San Francisco, that he would not hold a grudge, because rancor was a luxury that widows who ran businesses could not afford, that she wished him a more honest life in the future. As Margaret prepared to leave, Eleanor did something unexpected. He offered to accompany her back to the city. He said that the two had been deceived by the same man, and that this created a strange brotherhood between them, that perhaps they could find comfort in each other's company during the return journey. Thomas watched the two women prepare their mounts, moving with an efficiency that completely excluded their presence. They talked in low tones, sharing details of the letters he had sent, comparing the promises he had made, building a complete portrait of his duplicity. When they finally left, they left Thomas alone on the ranch with only his guilty conscience and the unforgiving vastness of the desert. He stood on the porch for hours, watching the figures of the two women disappear into the distance, carrying with him all the possibilities for the future he had imagined. The sun reached its zenith and began to decline again before Thomas finally saddled up his hired horse. There was nothing left for him in Cedar Creek. He had lost both women through his own cowardice and dishonesty. The dream of a new life in the West had vanished like a mirage in the desert heat. During the ride back to the city, Thomas understood a bitter truth about himself. He had sought love through letters because it was easier to create idealized versions of himself on paper than to face the reality of who he really was. He had divided his attention between two women because he wasn't brave enough to fully commit to a choice. By the time it arrived at the Cedar Creek station, the afternoon train was preparing to depart. Thomas bought a ticket back to San Francisco, carrying only his suitcase and the weight of two wasted opportunities. As the train picked up speed, he saw for the last time the hills where Eleanor raised her horses and the town where Margaret ran her boarding house. Both would go on with their lives without him. Eleanor would continue to build her empire in the desert, strong and independent as ever. Margaret would eventually find a man who knew how to value her kindness without sharing it with others. They had discovered that they were greater than the love he had offered, that they could crush with their dignity any false feeling he tried to impose. The train disappeared over the horizon, taking Thomas back to a life he now knew was insufficient. I had learned that true love requires courage to make difficult choices, honesty to face consequences, and integrity to earn someone else's trust. In the desert that was left behind, the wind continued to blow between the rocks, carrying with it the fragments of broken dreams and the promise that life, merciless but just, always takes its toll on the cowardice of those who do not have the courage to live completely. If this story of choices and consequences has touched your heart, you can't miss our upcoming adventures of the American Wild West, where men and women face moral dilemmas under the relentless desert sun and discover who they really are when tested by the wildlife of the frontier. Subscribe to the channel and leave your comment below telling us what was the most emotional moment of this story for you. Was it when Thomas met Margaret and felt the weight of guilt, when Eleanor showed her strength on the ranch, or when the two women united in their dignity, showing that they were greater than any fake love?